So I was a part of Team 11 along with Mark and Shreya, and our topic was deer overpopulation. So currently, Maryland's white-tailed deer population is estimated at around 230,000 to 250,000, which is a huge number and it's far above sustainable levels. Currently, Maryland has some regulations in place in order to manage this population, including controlled hunts, expanded hunting seasons, community based plans, and non lethal options like immunocontraception. However, these efforts are really complicated because there's a necessity to balance public sentiment with things like wildlife ethics and environmental health, especially in places that are very densely populated. Because deer have no natural predators and because there's a lot of urbanization, there's a lot of responsibility on policymakers and communities to pass effective solutions. And we think that addressing this crisis requires sustainable and long term policies that consider ecosystems, public safety, and conservation, as well as agricultural priorities. So, some incentives for this bill, one of them is environmental impact, because currently deer consume huge amounts of vegetation, which damages forests and biodiversity. Second is their agricultural impact. So, deer tend to consume farmers' crops, which has had a huge negative economic effect. A third concern is Lyme disease, because deer are a blood source for ticks, and they spread Lyme disease, which is a very serious health concern, especially in Maryland and areas around it. Another issue is wildlife vehicle collisions. Tens of thousands of car accidents involving deer happen annually in Maryland, and many of these result in very serious injuries or death. And one common problem that Maryland faces currently is that residents feed deers, and feeding deers increases and supports the deer population as it grows, which exacerbates all the issues mentioned above. So there's been relevant legislation. Currently, the state of Maryland has narrowed solutions for deer overpopulation to one main method, which is regulated deer hunting. So the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, or the DNR, is focusing on protecting white-tailed deer while also keeping their population controlled. And a direct quote from the DNR is that regulated deer hunting is the most effective tool for maintaining deer populations at appropriate levels. This is both in Maryland and also across North America. Past bills SB 367 or HB 481 authorizes Maryland's deer management programs to continue. And the Maryland Farm Bureau states that these programs are central in addressing deer related problems as recognized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And another important statistic is that Maryland farmers lose over $10 million annually to wildlife crop damage, and deer are responsible for more than three-quarters of these losses. Currently, Howard County's only measure is a 23-page comprehensive deer management plan. This also encourages residents to take personal action. So it suggests things like collecting and studying deer vehicle accident data, monitoring reflector effectiveness, and investigating preventive measures. However, these efforts have not significantly reduced public frustration, which is why we're proposing alternative proposals. In other states, there's also been deer management, so it varies by state depending on whether or not deer overpopulation is considered a significant issue. Illinois is facing similar challenges to Maryland with deer damaging crops. So the Republican state senator Chapin Rose highlighted that a farmer in one of their counties lost $45,000 from deer related crop damage. So they are advocating for SB 710, which is a bill in Illinois to make deer hunting regulations more flexible and allowing farmers and landlords to apply for and obtain hunting permits. Virginia has also implemented deer hunting regulations with varying bag limits, which is basically the number of deer a hunter can harvest per year, and it depends on location. Bridgeport, West Virginia is also enforcing penalties for feeding white-tailed deer. So the first offense would be $100 fine, the second is $150, and the third is $200. And as you see, our proposal is going to be modeled after this one. So, for the abstract, white-tailed deer overpopulation in Maryland threatens ecological integrity, public safety, and economic stability. The consequences of this are higher rates of deer vehicle collisions, crop losses, reduced biodiversity, and the increased risk of Lyme disease. And we think that current management programs and legislative efforts leave significant gaps, especially in counties like Howard that lack enforceable regulations or incentive based policies. So, our proposal recommends a multi pronged state supported strategy that I will talk about in a bit. So, moving on to our proposal, we have it divided on separate levels. The first one is county level ordinances. So, in counties that have over 30 deer per square mile, we would require management plans and also conduct regular population assessments and publish public damage reports. These could be relating to crop loss, collisions, ecological impacts, etc. Second, state grants and farmer support. As I mentioned above, farmers and agriculture are one of the most kind of damaged by deer. So we think it's important to have grants for immunocontraception pilots in high opposition suburban zones. These would essentially prevent deer from reproducing, farmer subsidies for deer resistant fencing and crop protection, and community monitoring of deer numbers and collisions. We would also implement a feeding ban that would prohibit intentional deer feeding in high damage counties, and the penalties would be $100 for the first, 150 for the second, and 200 subsequent for subsequent ones, in addition to possible civil penalties. And exceptions would be if deer are a part of license in like rehab centers or for the purpose of approved research. A next step is public education and reporting. So we would partner with counties and NGOs for awareness campaigns on deer impacts, safe driving, and legal compliance, and create an online portal for reporting damages, collisions, and feeding violations. And for the impact evaluation, the DNR would have an annual report to the General Assembly, which tracks population trends, program participation, collision reduction rates, crop yield recovery, and public sentiment, so we can assess whether we need to move forward. And the implementation timeline, because this proposal has many parts to it, we thought it would be best to segment it over the course of 3 years. So the first would be counties adopting ordinances and grant applications open. The second, we would launch immunocontraception trials, enforce feeding bans. And lastly, we would evaluate results and consider statewide expansion. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I think your team did much more than I asked. So that's great. Thank you very much. You covered much more than I expected. That's a great job. I think it's pretty comprehensive. I like the approach is sort about both education and then the fines part, right? You want to really inform the residents, not feeding deer. And then I always select beer. So and then some other part of the work. Great job. I really appreciate that. And I just want to highlight the team. This topic actually comes a little later when we received a constituent concern about their neighbors feeding deer, and then said, okay, maybe we should have some legislation to prevent that. And then this team takes the extra effort to work on this topic in a timely manner. Thank you very much, Alison.